My name is Damali Sali and I welcome you to this episode of the Ideation Corner. The Ideation Corner is a space where ideas are discussed and dissected. And today I host Vanessa Nakate. Vanessa is a climate justice activist and the author of The Bigger Picture. And she's going to tell us all about it. Vanessa, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much.
All right.
I'm very happy to be here and to also know that through this many people can get inspired to do something about the environment, and about the lives of the people. I remember in 2018, I started to do a lot of research about some of the challenges that the people in my country, Uganda, were facing. And when I realized that climate change was one of those challenges, I was actually surprised. We all know climate change in school to just be the changes in weather patterns over a long period of time, but we are not taught the reality of what's actually happening on the ground. So I started to read more about climate change to understand the causes, but also understand the impacts of this crisis. And as I read through the impacts, I realized that some of these things were already unfolding in Uganda. For example, the floods, the landslides, the droughts. So with the rising, global temperatures, there are these changes in weather patterns causing these climate disasters. And when I saw how much it threatens so many people, threatens Uganda as an economy, because we know that Uganda heavily depends on agriculture, for the survival of so many communities. And where the climate crisis is, it means, crops getting dried up in intense heat, or farms getting destroyed and washed away because of landslides or because of floods. So this was a challenge for so many people, because in the end, a lack of rain means starvation for so many people. And too much rainfall means destruction. And when you're in Kampala, sometimes, you don't think about what happens beyond your family or beyond your house. But when you start to look and you see how people's lives are impacted, for example, in places in Kasese, areas, around Mount Elgon, you realize how much climate change is actually real and affecting so many people. So in that time, I decided that I had to do something about it. I had to use my voice and my platforms to demand for climate justice and to also create awareness, because there is need for people, to know about this challenge. Because when people know, they always find something to do. Mm-hmm. If you know that you're in a burning house, you do everything you can to get out of that house. So that's why we believe creating awareness for the climate crisis is so important, because we need as many, climate activists as possible to rise up for the people and for the planet. So what I did personally, being inspired by Greta Thunberg from Sweden, who had started the climate strikes, I also started striking every Friday and sharing, most of my strikes on social media. I started to reach out to different communities. I started to reach out to schools as well, to create this awareness about, climate issues, but not only to create or communicate the crisis, but to also communicate the power in people's voices, the power in people's actions in transforming this world and making it a better place for all of us. So along the way, I have, got to work with different activists within Uganda to do different projects, different programs, and I think it's been 3 years now of activism. And like I said, last year, my book was launched, A Bigger Picture. And, A Bigger Picture tells a story of me when I started my activism and why I started my activism. But it doesn't just talk about my story, but it also talks about stories of different activists in Uganda, different activists across the African continent, because I thought it was important, to have more voices, more stories, and more experiences included, in this book. Every activist has a story to tell, and every story has a solution to give, and every solution has a life to change. So it was very important for me to have, different voices, different activists, have their work mentioned and talked about in a bigger picture. And, in a bigger picture, I also talk about some intersections of climate change and the other issues, that affect people. For example, I remember months, when I had just started striking for climate, many people, would make comments like, why are you fighting for the climate? And yet, you could fight for poverty instead, to end poverty, because that's what's happening in many places. But then I started to educate myself about how, poverty intersects with climate change. And I got to understand that as, the climate disasters, as they destroy people's homes, as they destroy schools, as they destroy people's farms, people's sources of income, people are actually left in poverty, in extreme poverty. So I got to understand that the climate crisis actually creates poverty traps that are passed on to, generations in communities. And I realized that we can't have, climate justice without, poverty eradication. And we cannot have, poverty eradication without climate justice. The two go hand in hand. I started to explore more and learn more, about, things like zero hunger, and realizing if climate change is leaving millions of people with no access to food, that means that we can't achieve zero hunger without climate justice. We've seen, the recent Eastern African drought that left more than 26 million people with no access to food and no access to water. So in a bigger picture, I also talk about these connections of, the climate crisis and other issues.
Okay. I am so glad that in the bigger picture, you first of all, you're detailing your journey.
Yeah.
But then also you're giving a platform to the other climate activists who are in the space. And I also then remember also you tend to talk about there can be climate justice without racial justice. So in what context do you put that?
Yeah, that's again another intersection of climate change and, for example, racial injustice. Racial injustice and climate injustice can be talked about in a number of forms, and I'll just mention some of them. For example, we realize that, Black people or Black communities are the ones who are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Starting with the African continent itself, historically, Africa as a continent is responsible for less than 4% of global emissions. And yet many Africans are already suffering some of the most brutal impacts of the climate crisis. I've given you examples of what climate change has done in Uganda, examples of how, the Eastern Africa drought that left more than 26 million people dead, and hungry and failing to access, food and water. And then, there was a tropical storm Anna that landed in southern Africa just a few days back, and it has caused massive destruction, in areas of Madagascar, Malawi, Mozambique, leaving, over 80 people dead, thousands, losing their homes. Schools have also been destroyed, power lines have been buried, and people, have no access to electricity as well. And when you look at how the climate crisis has been affecting some of these regions, you realize that just in 2019, Cyclone Idai ripped apart large parts of the African continent, and it's still the same countries, Mozambique, Malawi, that were so impacted, and it left more than 1,300 people dead. So the climate crisis is, already destroying vast parts of the African continent. And that's an injustice, because in the end, we know that Africa is one of the least contributors of CO2 emissions. Okay. We've also seen Black communities, not just in Africa, but even in the United States, even in Europe, even in the UK, many Black residences are in places, that are exposed to air pollution, to water pollution. I can give the example of the Flint water crisis, that exposed so many Black children to unclean water. There's a story of a young girl in the UK whose death was recently connected to air pollution, a young Black girl. So these are some of the issues of race and climate, and also to bring it in the perspective of who is being listened to in some of these spaces. While Africa, while the African continent is on the front lines of the climate crisis, it is not on the front pages of the world's newspapers. And we've seen different activists from Africa struggle to have their voices listened to, their voices platformed and amplified, probably through interviews or through conferences. The previous, COP26, which just ended last year, I saw how some, activists couldn't make it to the COP because they couldn't access vaccination because of vaccine iniquities, because they couldn't access funding or accreditation to attend the conference. So in the end, how can we have climate justice if the most affected people are not in the climate conversations? So in the end, we can't have, climate justice without racial justice. The two go hand in hand and intersect with each other, because it's like one system, and if one part of the system is broken, eventually the whole system will come crashing down.
Okay, so you did mention Africa contributing less than 4% to the
global emissions,
and on top of that, our African voices not necessarily being given the audience, the platforms to be able to air that, and yet they're the same communities that are affected the most. What do you feel can be done about that by, first of all, the people themselves, the Africans, but then also maybe also the governments?
We as African people, we have a responsibility to speak out for ourselves. If you're not given a table, you create that table for yourself. So we have a responsibility to speak out for ourselves and use our platforms to demand for climate justice, for the African continent. Because when you really think about how it is one of the least emitters, and yet it is among the most affected by the climate crisis, that enough should, give you the push you need to demand for climate justice for the African continent. And when it comes to the African leaders, there's a huge responsibility on the African leaders to unite behind the science, to unite with the activists and help us in demanding for climate justice. And one of the ways is through some of the investments that African leaders accept in African countries. They're harmful to biodiversity, to ecosystems, to the planet itself. So one of the ways is saving investments, and having investments that don't harm the people and the planet, but investments that ensure that the people are protected and the planet, is also protected. And the other thing, as we go, as we head towards COP27, it's going to be in Egypt. It's going to be on African land, on African soil, So it's a huge opportunity for African leaders to really unite together and put demands on, climate issues like climate finance, to talk about the loss and damage that is already happening on the African continent when it comes to the climate crisis. Because when we as activists, we will speak and demand, but we need the leaders as well to come in, the ones who end up in those negotiation rooms, to come in and unite as African leaders to put a demand, especially for climate finance. And talking about climate finance, you've asked what needs to be done for the African continent, to make things better. we need climate finance. We need climate finance for adaptation, climate finance for mitigation, climate finance for loss and damage. As we see the climate crisis, loss and damage is already happening. Loss and damage is leaving so many people with nothing. People are losing cultures, people are losing their histories, and we can't adapt to lost histories. We can't adapt to lost identities. We cannot adapt to starvation. We can't adapt to, the losses and the damages that are happening because of the climate crisis. So it's important that, a demand is put, a demand for climate finance, because we know who caused the climate crisis and we know who needs to pay, for the climate crisis. This is a matter of reparations, giving climate finance to vulnerable countries that are, already suffering the worst impacts of the climate crisis, so that they can easily build greener economies for their citizens. We've had questions like, we've seen scenarios where African nations are facing so much pressure to transition, and yet this transition also threatens people in terms of employment. So the question is, how are African nations going to transition, to greener economies without having to bury the people in extreme poverty? So there is a huge responsibility for the global north to provide climate finance for adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, so that African nations can easily build and transition their economies, to more sustainable economies, so that in the end, the planet is protected and people are protected. People are not buried into extreme poverty and more suffering.
Okay. Thanks. You mentioned COP27, and recently you guys were at COP26.
Yeah.
I didn't follow it very closely, but of the people views I saw, it appeared that people felt like nothing. It was more talking. Yeah. Talking. Do you feel that was your same opinion? And also, do you think then COP27 will be any different?
Well, I can first say we've had 26 COPs.
I forget.
And, with all these 26 COPs, emissions have continued to rise. Temperatures have continued to rise, and the climate crisis has continued to escalate, and people have continued to suffer. And while at the COP, there are these celebrations within the halls that, something was happening, something positive was happening. And then, as the COP was almost coming to an end, there's this climate tracker that shows us that we are on a pathway of 2.4 degrees Celsius with all the commitments and promises, that have been made by the leaders. So you realize that 2.4 degrees is global devastation for so many communities. It is a death sentence for so many communities. 1.2 degrees is already,
We're at 1.2?
Yes.
And we're on a pathway to get to 2.4?
Yes, that's what the climate tracker showed.
We're going to double it?
It's more like doubling it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So 1.2 is already disastrous for so many people, especially, on the African continent. So what will 2.4 degrees do? So you realize that even with the commitments, we are still speeding up in the wrong direction. And, as we head to COP27, my message to leaders is that commitments will not stop the warming of the planet, and promises will not stop the global temperatures from rising up. The pledges will not stop the suffering of people, because we've had all these COPs. I haven't attended all of them, but I'm certain they've been full of commitments and promises and pledges, and yet the situation continues to get worse. So it won't be commitments or promises or pledges that will save the planet. It will be real action. And that's what we hope to see at COP27.
Okay. You did talk about climate finance. My question, me not knowing much about this climate crisis, I follow it from from an observer end. Is there already money for climate finance? Have they provided that money, or are there just commitments for climate finance?
Well, a few years back, $100 billion was promised by, the global north for vulnerable countries to be able to, cope with the climate crisis. And it has not yet been delivered. So those are some of the, the challenges that we see, in the climate conversations, that even the promised money has not yet been delivered, for the countries that are vulnerable to the climate crisis. And we also saw no separate fund was put in place, for loss and damage at the COP26. But we hope to change that, with continuous activism at COP27.
Okay, that's great. And then you did talk about, I noticed that you're taking a big push or position on ensuring that while most people know you, they don't know the other activists, but I see that you're really working hard in ensuring that it's not just you, there are others.
Yeah.
And in fact, come to think of it, even your book is that you also put your journey, but also the journeys of others.
Yeah.
How important do you think that is? And then also I would like to know how many other activists have you put in who are not necessarily from Uganda, but other African countries?
Yeah, I think it's important for everyone to tell their own experience, I may have, statistics about what is happening in Kenya, maybe through the news, but I don't have that personal experience. And yet another activist who lives in Kenya has that, personal experience, and they can easily articulate what is happening in their communities. So that's why I think it's important for every activist to tell their own story, to tell their own experience. I think that's how, we will ensure that we have, climate justice when everyone is really listened to. That's why it's really important for people to know that the climate movement is more than one face or two faces or three faces. It has millions of faces from different parts of the world. And in a bigger picture, like I said, it goes beyond activists in Uganda, but you'll find, activists from Kenya, Nigeria, Togo, more activists from, the African continent.
Are there any measures that you guys are going to take to ensure that now that COP27 is going to be in Egypt on the African continent, that we will have more African voices, African faces present, advocating? Because they can shut you up by just not showing you, even if you're there. It's happened to you, you were there and then they cut you out of a picture. Twice, I think it's happened. Or they record and then you're part of the table and then you're not in the camera view of that. Or you're there and then they don't even mention your name. But what can the African activists do that at least this time COP27 is on the African continent? What can we ensure that our voice now is even louder?
Well, I think the first step would be ensuring that we have as many climate activists as possible from the African continent. And that's something we are also working on and discussing, to ensure that, organizations support activists to go to the COP. I think that is the first step in ensuring that the different activists from Africa are listened to, that they make it to the COP in Egypt. And I think the other thing about ensuring that we are not removed from conversations or, cropped out. You just never know when you're going to be cropped out or removed from a conversation. But, what happens after that, that maybe that incident, that is what we need to do to speak out, against, those things, to continuously speak out against that and continuously use our platforms. Because again, we are not, in the editing spaces of those pictures or, those places where they decide who to be shown, but we can still continue to push our voices even when such incidences happen. We ask why, they have happened. I think that's very important.
Okay. We've been talking about the bigger picture. Where can someone find the book? How much does it cost? Which bookstores is it in?
Well, a bigger picture can be found at African Writers Trust. They are located in Charlie Wajala, but you can find them on Twitter and they can give you information on how you can find them. and then a restock. I won't say, prices, because libraries set their own prices. So, yeah, but you can, a restock, that's in Kampala, and African Writers Trust.
Okay.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to write?
Couple of months. I wrote it, I started writing it in 2020, the period of, when COVID, when we were in lockdown. Yeah, so a couple of months, maybe 10.
10, okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I always try to understand people's process of writing, because I also wrote a book.
Wow.
And it was a different process. It was a hectic process, I felt.
Oh,
so,
sorry about that.
So, and why did you decide to write a book?
Well, I never actually decided to write a book. I was reached out to by a lady. Her name is Johanna. Yeah, she reached out to me, and, she was working with a publishing company in Germany. And she was, telling me how it would be important, for them to publish a book that was, written by me, and how, they would like to amplify and support my voice. And that's when I started to think that I could write a book. So it wasn't my initial thought, it was initiated by someone else.
Okay, but it's good that you jumped on it.
Yeah, I'm glad I did.
Because in a way you're trying to balance that while you're being cropped out and cut out. At least there's someone saying, no, actually, I want to hear your voice. I want to give it an opportunity to, to be heard.
Yeah.
And then, was it you then who decided also to include others? Because you could have just written your story.
Yeah, it was, when I decided, when, the lady reached out, now I started to ask myself, what would I write about in this book? Yeah, so the different, things I write about, it's just me writing. Yeah.
Okay. So Vanessa, we've come to the end of our discussion. Yeah. Thank you so much. Is there any lasting words you'd like to say, anything you want to emphasize?
Yeah, I think I would just love to say that, whoever watches this or listens to this, that Earth is our home and it's our responsibility. And we can all find something that we can do, to ensure that, our planet is protected and also the people are protected. It doesn't matter the resources that you have. No action is too small to make a difference, and no voice is too small as well to make a difference. When we put all these actions together, we realize how much we are actually transforming not only our communities, but transforming, the world. And lastly, to just say thank you to you for giving me this platform to talk about climate activism. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, there you had it from Vanessa Nakate. You can get her book, The Bigger Picture, from Aristoc or the African Writers Trust. Please look out for it. Please go find it. Please listen to the interview. Please take her advice on no voice is too small, no action is too small for us to protect the environment. Thank you so much.